Hi everyone, welcome to Logging Off, Ways to Stop Cyberbullying. My name is Whitney, Waugh. I'm a postdoc fellow here at the Child Study Center.
Hi, I'm Jessica Zweifach. I'm a psychology intern here.
Unfortunately, Dr. Evans couldn't be with us today because she's presenting at a conference in DC, but we're going to take you through some facts on cyberbullying. We're going to talk about prevention and some ways to treat it and address it.
So to start off, we're just going to talk a little bit about what bullying is. So bullying we define as an unhealthy situation where a person or a group is using superior size, power, or status to win concessions from a more vulnerable group or person. So there we have the intent to do harm, the imbalance of power, and that can be a real or perceived imbalance of power, and also often repeated harmful behavior. And it's important to remember that there is some amount of normative conflict in childhood and adolescence, but bullying is apart from that normative conflict.
So what is bullying? Bullying includes physical aggression, verbal acts of aggression, and social alienation. And we can think of it on a scale of mild, moderate to severe. Now, Jesse, before we get further into this, let's just think back, and you guys at home can do this as well, to what you picture as your prototypical bully from maybe your childhood. So Jesse, what do you think about?
I think of imagining sort of a stereotype that you might see on TV or in a movie, sort of I'm picturing a male and someone who's very strong and aggressive.
Yeah, I think about someone who's a little bit bigger than everyone else, maybe their peers. Now let's take a second and think about our prototypical cyberbully, right? That's a little harder, at least for me to do. When I think about cyberbullying specifically, I think a lot about verbal aggression, so that middle category on your screen. The mocking, the name calling online, the phone harassment, the threats of violence online. And I think a little bit about social alienation as well. But it's important that cyberbullies also engage in physical aggression, that sometimes cyberbullies post videos or threatening comments online that show physical aggression.
So the prevalence of bullying. It's important to remember that there is a high prevalence of bullying and that a typical child has about a 30% chance of being bullied at school. But also there are the bullies, those who are bullied, and bystanders. 85% of bullying incidents involve children other than the bully and the victim in some way. And if we think back to our childhoods, we might not remember what we were reading in school or what happened in 1st or 5th grade, but we might actually remember bullying incidents and even being around bullies. And we hear this from our patients here at the Child Study Center all the time, that those kind of emotional, difficult situations are really prominent in their memories.
And that goes for both positive and negative events, right? So we remember the really exciting times at school and from our childhood, and we also remember these big events that occur. So today we're all here to talk specifically about cyberbullying, and we define cyberbullying as bullying through email, through instant message, through chat rooms, websites, or gaming sites. Pretty much any digital message or image sent through a cellular phone, a website, a computer, a tablet, an iPhone, or any form of media.
And whether we like it or not, media and technology are everywhere right now. More and more children and adolescents have increasing access to media. About a quarter of teenagers describe themselves as always being involved, constantly connected to the internet. And about 3/4 of teens own a smartphone. We also know that about half of the time, adolescents who are online are engaging in more than one activity. So we have to think about this with our kids. Are they online doing research for a project? Possibly, but they're also likely online in some sort of social media interaction or something else. So we want to think about monitoring.
Yeah, and monitoring is getting harder and harder because kids are multitasking and switching screens. So when we think about monitoring, we really need to be active.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's talk specifically about social media. We know that 76% of teenagers are using at least one social media site. And while these statistics are changing, Facebook remains one of the most popular websites that they're accessing. Teenagers don't typically commit to just one social media platform, and we're seeing that about 70% maintain what we call a social media portfolio. And that means that they're logging on to things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. that they're having multiple accounts which they're engaging in, and sometimes cross-posting messages on. But beyond the number of hours spent on social media, a key factor is how the individual actually uses social media. So we know that passive social media use, which is kind of just watching what other people do, reading other people's content, relates to declines in well-being and life satisfaction, while more active use, so actually engaging in the media, talking about pros and cons, talking about your opinion related to what's been being posted, maybe talking person to person about what's being posted, is actually not related to these problems.
So here we're looking at the lifetime cyberbullying victimization rates, and we can see that about 27.9% of those who responded, and this is data from middle and high schoolers from the Cyberbullying Research Center. About 27.9% of those who responded said they experienced cyberbullying, so that's a high prevalence rate. We also know that an average of about 15 or 16% of those surveyed were cyberbullying offenders, so reported that they had engaged in actual cyberbullying.
So here we're looking at some statistics on cyberbullying by gender, and we want to go back to that prototypical bully that we had you guys think about. And what we see here actually is that girls are being cyberbullied more often than boys, and this is occurring in a lot of different domains. Really the only domain where we're seeing boys experiencing more cyberbullying is when people are posting mean videos or hurtful pictures online. There's a slightly higher rate of that happening to boys than girls.
And it's extremely important for us to address bullying for a number of different angles because there are both short and long-term consequences of bullying. We have to be thinking about the victims and how being a victim of a bully is associated with increased depression, anxiety, loneliness, problems with schoolwork, and eventually low school attendance because of trying to avoid those bullying interactions. Then there are the bullies. Being a bully is associated with delinquent behavior and later on into adulthood criminality as well. Also substance use and poor school performance. And bystanders, this is the group that I tend to think the least about, but there are a number of reasons we should be thinking about bystanders to bullying interactions because they often have fears about safety, develop the belief that adults can or won't protect them, and also have guilt over not aiding the victim. So we really need to address this for a number of different groups of people, really for all kids.
So how do we address bullying? So we're going to talk about three different areas. One's parenting interventions, one's school tips, and one's child tools. And before we do that, I forgot to mention that you can submit questions at any time today by typing them in the questions panel of the control panel. It's on the right side of your screen, so we'll answer those questions at the end of our presentation. Sorry about that. So now we'll talk about parents and bullies. So parents can influence kids' exposure to media, so they can influence how much and what types of media children use. And we really want to think whenever possible about prevention. So we want to start monitoring media use early and having preset guidelines. And starting rules early allows kids to kind of grow into controlled media use. It makes it easier when kids get older and want to use different types of media, want to have a larger portfolio for them to understand and to accept that there'll be regulations on these things and that they're kind of buying into it early. We can intervene to impact the effects on media on children's behavior through multiple different avenues. So parents can strengthen or weaken media effects by influencing their children's cognitive responses to media, so thinking about their attention, what they're looking at, how long they're engaging in it, as well as their thought process surrounding what's posted online. We can influence, as adults, kids' emotional reactions, so we can encourage empathy and thinking about other people's feelings, and also thinking about what their posts are saying about their own emotions. And we can also influence kids' excitative or arousal levels in response to media. So we can help them regulate and help them maybe think, do I want to post this now, or do I want to put it in my to be sent basket and send it later when I've had some time to think about it and the implications of whatever I'm posting or what I'm reading.
So parental mediation is really important, and it's repeatedly found to influence media use. And there are different ways we can do this. There's the restrictive mediation, so that's the rule setting, the limit setting, whether we're limiting the apps that kids can use or the times they can use tablets and all other forms of technology. And then there's the active mediation, so talking with kids about media content. And both of these are really important, but we really do want to be seeing more of the active mediation. We want to have an open communication and a dialogue with our kids so that they're comfortable bringing up what kinds of interactions they're experiencing.
We also know that parenting style influences children's behavior related to media. So controlling parenting, which is using a lot of punishments and threats and harsh consequences, as well as inconsistent parenting, which is alternating between very strict and very permissive parenting, relates to unfavorable media behaviors. So things like family conflict and aggression. While the more supportive, autonomy-supportive parenting, so being considerate of a child's perspective and having a dialogue around these things, was negatively associated with those unfavorable behaviors. So they have relates more to positive outcomes in the long run. But there is this phenomenon that we call the boomerang effect. And what that means is that parenting style that's perceived by the child as threatening their independence causes what we call reactions or reactance, which actually increases the likelihood that an adolescent in particular will engage in negative behaviors. So we want to really be careful about how we deliver the messages that we're giving to kids.
So we also want to think about our own media use. So parent media use is a very strong predictor of child media habits. When parents are distracted by media, they could be missing opportunities for those emotional connections that are known to improve children's health. So heavy parent use of mobile devices is associated with fewer verbal and nonverbal interactions between parents and kids, and could also be associated with more parent-child conflict. We know that as adults, as parents, we really are models for our kids. So we want to make sure we're modeling behavior we want to see, and we want to be making sure that, for example, at the dinner table, we're allowing for open dialogue and communication as opposed to all being locked in and isolated on our own social media.
Yeah, and I think this is a great opportunity to practice what we preach a little and be really careful and monitor our own comments that we make online and the side comments that we make as we're scrolling through our own social media portfolios. So one thing that we work to do here at the Child Study Center is increase parental awareness surrounding media. This is a really unique domain where children often know more than their parents, and the children teach parents how to use different forms of media as well as computers and technology. So part of our role as clinicians is to help you guys understand the cost and the benefits of children's media use and to help instill some sense of control. Because we know that media is not going anywhere and that it has a place, and that kids can really benefit from being online and engaging in these materials. So we just want to help increase understanding as well as awareness. And one great tool for doing that is actually Common Sense Media. You can Google it. If you type in Common Sense Media, it will pop up. And this is a great resource because it reviews apps, books, movies, different forms of technology. And it gives you a really nice summary of what it's used for, what kids will be exposed to. So is there violence? Is there sexual content? What age group is this movie appropriate for? It's actually just great to get a review of a movie you might be going to see or want to watch. So there's some benefits for us as parents as well.
We also want to think as parents about controlling access and content, right? So there are a couple of ways we can do this. First, by contacting our mobile providers. Verizon, AT&T, they all have ways of limiting access in certain ways. We can look at our children's wireless usage. We can limit the number of apps that a child can have. We can have the phone lock at certain times and have restricted times where they're not able to be on the phone and engage in media. So it's important to sort of know what your provider can offer and how they can help you. You can also download certain apps that help control use. One that we know about is dinner time. Again, it sets limits for when the phone can be used. That's only for Android, so it's important to reach out and make sure you know the ways that you can use different apps and also contact your mobile provider. One thing that we were thinking about is that flip phones actually remove some of these problems. iPhones in certain ways have limited effectiveness because wherever there's internet, you can be on social media. and it's harder to control. So it's something to think about if what you really want for your child is to be able to be in touch, know when they're on the way home from school, know when they're on the way back, and when they've reached school. You can do that with a flip phone and maybe don't need the more advanced smartphone.
And I think it's important to remember that while a ton of people have these fancy phones, that really they are a privilege, and that kids need to be showing us that they're capable of having that privilege and that they earn that privilege, and that it's something that you can go back to if you feel like your children have re-earned your trust. So it's really important to think about how we talk to kids about cyberbullying. And what we see in this graph is that kids are feeling a lot of different emotions when they're cyberbullied. The victims feel angry, frustrated, sad, embarrassed, scared. And some kids say that they're not bothered. And what we have to do is really take the time to listen and understand what our kid is going through. And that might be different for different children in your family, even if they're exposed to the same content. So we need to listen and validate the emotion before we jump into that problem-solving mode. It's really easy to want to put that Band-Aid on quickly when kids go through a traumatic event like cyberbullying, and we really want to take a step back and listen before we take any action. So now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about school and more community-level interventions. But before we do that, we want to talk a little bit about tolerance. And tolerance is, leads to acceptance of violence and aggression. So each time we tolerate a violent or aggressive act, our inaction is saying that we agree that that person is entitled to use violence or aggression. And this is confusing because what events should be tolerated and what events should be ignored? It's hard to sometimes know that. But whenever we see something that's violence or aggression, we really should be taking action to take a stand against it. And part of the confusion comes from the fact that research often confines violence to major acts, so things like assault or rapes. And we as educators, clinicians, parents often define violence like the studies do. So minor acts are considered normal, which really they're not. And what we know is that minor acts of aggression are a gateway to later larger acts of violence.
So thinking back about schools, it's really important that schools have a school-wide policy where it's clear to all involved that violence just will not be tolerated in the school. It's important to define violence as well. So violence should be defined as any mean word, look, sign, or act that hurts another person's body, feelings, or things. So it shouldn't be only physical aggression. We have to make sure that we're thinking about the ways in which social media play into this and play into bullying. It's just important to remember that students and staff have the right to be in a school environment where they feel safe and protected. And part of that is making sure that everyone in the school community is on board and clear about the policy.
So we have 3 guiding principles whenever we're thinking about an intervention. And the first is that you're not responsible for others, but to them. It's really hard because in the end, we can only control ourselves. Now, there are steps that we can take to shape our environment and to hopefully make people make choices that are in line with our values, but in the end it comes down to we can only change ourselves. The second is that everyone needs a connector. So everyone needs to feel like they're part of a community, and what we need to do is help kind of pull back into the fold those marginalized kids. And then lastly, violence is systemic. It requires a systemic approach to deal with effectively over time. So we really need to pull together our community.
So now we're going to go over some of the key components of change. So the first we sort of alluded to already. We need to make sure we're involving everyone in the school community, the administration, the staff, everyone, the parents, because everyone has a different perspective on different situations and what's been going on in terms of bullying.
Yeah, and after we get people involved, we need to establish a leadership committee because we need to make sure that different tasks are getting taken care of and that we don't just galvanize all these people and then not have a goal and steps to follow.
It's also really important for the committee and those involved to assess the problem. We want to make sure there really is bullying going on. We want to make sure we know what parties are involved, whether it's large scale or small. So it's important to get many people's perspectives before jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, and we want to make it a full school priority. We want to have days dedicated to it in school or talk about it in the school context.
And we also want to build caring communities in our schools. That can be outside of bullying, where we're making sure that people feel connected, people feel included, people feel engaged. Because we know that if people feel that way in a school, bullying will be less likely to occur.
Yeah, and part of having a caring community is teaching kids social and emotional skills. So how do you communicate online? How do you talk about emotions? How do your behaviors impact other people's feelings?
We also want to make sure that firm and fair boundaries and limits are a part of the school's policy. So we want to make sure that people know what the consequences are and why it's so important to be avoiding bullying.
Yeah, and then, after we put those consequences or those boundaries in place, when there are bullying events, we want to respond to them quickly and following the guidelines that we preset.
We also want to be empowering victims, and this can really be through a number of the things we've already described, such as teaching those social and emotional skills, making sure people feel that they have a voice, and making sure that kids know which adults in the school they can contact if they're feeling victimized.
And lastly, we want to empower bystanders. We want to say that this is your community and that you need to stand up for yourselves and the people around you, and that in standing up, you'll be supported. All right, and lastly, we're going to go through some child-directed interventions. So what we really do is treat symptoms when kids come into our offices. For the victims and the bystanders, we always address things like trauma, anxiety, and mood symptoms, or anything else that they're coming in with. We want to target suicidal ideation and gestures, and that should be a primary goal because we have to keep kids safe. We want to build self-esteem. We might integrate some social skills training and assertiveness training so that kids know how to interact with each other and how to set limits and say, like, no, this is not okay for me. We want to instill internet safety, and we want to kind of talk about how they use the internet and who they're talking to and in what ways. And then we do what we call parent management training, which is really bringing in parents and helping them set limits, set rules and consequences, and help monitor kids' media use. Now, you might be surprised to see that a lot of the interventions that we do with bullying are actually pretty similar to those that we do with the victims and the bystanders. And that's because bullies are actually often victims themselves. With bullies in particular, we might increase the amount of parent management training we do because we really need to think about restricting access or controlling, when and how kids are using media. We'll target with bullies strain, anger, and frustration because we know that those are gateways to more violent acts later in life. We'll target things like trauma, disruptive behavior, and anxiety and mood or other symptoms within the bully. And we'll want to increase emotional understanding, so integrating some more empathy, understanding about how their posts impact other people. Because social media can be anonymous, I think sometimes we forget that we're actually interacting with another person. So we try to instill some more of that perspective taking. And lastly, we always address suicidal ideation as well for bullies. Research actually shows us that anyone who's affected by cyberbullying or any type of bullying, including the bully, the victim, and the bystander, they're at higher risk for suicidal ideation than someone who's not involved in cyberbullying. All right, so we have some time for questions now. So our first question is, would you recommend not allowing teens access to social media at all to protect them from bullying adverse effects? That's a great question, and I think one of the things that we always like to think about is that scale of balancing pros and cons. So today we talked a lot about the negative effects of media, but there's also a ton of positive effects, right? Kids are having access to friends and developing these really strong social connections over media. They're keeping in touch with people from summer camp and establishing lifelong relationships. So while we want to monitor, we don't want to completely restrict.
Right. It's just such a prevalent part of social life now as an adolescent or as an adult as well. So what we really want to be doing is helping to support our kids to use it appropriately as opposed to completely limiting it. And it is a great question because it's a hard thing as a parent to know that balance.
Yeah, and we also want to just think about where our line in the sand is too, right? Because if a child repeatedly is breaking our rules around media, then maybe we do want to restrict their access even more. But we recommend kind of using a tapered approach where, we start to instill more and more rules and consequences and engage in that monitoring and see if we can target it that way. But in the end, we have to keep our kids safe. So, we're not going to take that completely off the table, but we like to avoid it if possible. All right, so our second question. I monitor the phones, but I cannot monitor instant apps such as Snapchat and Instagram. Any suggestions if you fear your child is being bullied via these limited history apps? Another great question.
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things is that we can be involved in knowing who our child is friends with on these apps. There are different parental controls and ways that we can control and know who our kid is interacting with on these apps. It is very hard. To address the second part of your question, if you feel that your child's being bullied, we certainly wouldn't recommend going in on the phone without a child's permission, but we really go back to that open line of communication, and we hope that you could feel comfortable opening up the dialogue, sort of normalizing the idea that so many kids these days are being bullied over social media use, and then trying to work in the questions and support of your child.
We really want to try to open those lines of communication and encourage kids to come and talk to us. But we also sometimes need to monitor them because kids don't like to talk about the fact that they're being bullied, right? That's so uncomfortable and it's scary, and I think a lot of kids we talk to fear the consequences of having their parents or even having us know that they're being bullied because we like to do things about it, and sometimes that has trickle-down effects. So we really want to try to open the doors and the lines of communication so that kids feel comfortable bringing this to us. But it is a really fine dance that we have to engage in. All right, how would I comfort my child's former friend if they're opening different Instagram accounts? Oh, confront, sorry, can't read today. My former friend if they are opening different Instagram accounts to bully my child. That's a really great and difficult question.
Really difficult and hard, especially because these days we know lots of kids are making other accounts in order to do just what you're describing. In terms of confronting the child, most likely we would recommend going through the school in a case like this, assuming that this is a friend from school. A lot of schools' policies go beyond just being in the school walls, and so they could support you in different ways. I had a patient where there was a situation sort of like this, and the school counselor was wonderful and initiated sort of a mediation between the kids. Not that they were going to be friends again, but to make sure that things were being used appropriately, and also that child who was bullying was disciplined appropriately. So it's important to involve the school whenever possible so that it doesn't feel like only your responsibility or your child's responsibility.
Yeah, and we wouldn't recommend directly contacting another child who's not your own, or in most cases, directly contacting their parent. It can lead to some communication difficulties or misunderstandings. So it's best if we kind of gather a lot of information and then get some external help to confront the other family. All right, question number 4. How do I address my child if I found out that they're the cyberbully? And this is important given what Jesse was talking about, how 15%, a little over 15% of kids are actually cyberbullies themselves, and that bullies are victims and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it would be trying to figure out what your child is going through, maybe even using some validation here that Whitney was describing before, normalizing that a lot of the time when kids go through difficult things themselves, they're more likely to lash out at others, and to be really open. Don't try to catch your child in a lie. If you already know that they are engaging in cyberbullying, let the child know that.
Yeah, and sometimes kids do these things impulsively, and so we can help our kids take time to think before they act or think before they write. And also we want to let these kids know that while they made a mistake, it doesn't have to define them moving forward, that they can enact change, that they can work to repair some of these relationships and break out of these cycles. All right.
Great, so thanks for all the great questions and participation. On behalf of the Child Study Center, we really want to thank you for joining us today. And just so you know, when you log out or when you log off, you'll be sent a survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out. You'll also get a follow-up email in a couple of days with a link to a recording of the session. And we hope you can join us for the next webinar, Born to be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks and How to Keep Them Safe with Dr. Shatkin. And that'll be on Tuesday, November 7th, also at 1.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks
Bye.
so much. Take care.